reading today is Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 25. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her.
Good morning. So here's what I would ask you to do. I think this would probably be the best thing to do. If you will stick a marker right there in Ephesians 5, we're going to come back to Ephesians 5 and read from this text, but our first actual reading is going to come from Philippians 2. So you might want to open up your Bibles to Philippians 2 and be ready for that. And I'll also just throw this out there to you as well. Even though Philippians 2 is going to be the first place that I open my Bible to and read from, it's not going to be the first passage. I'm going to at least refer to Genesis 1 and 2 and Matthew 22. And so I think that will get you ready for this morning, and we'll all be on the same page. Thank you for being here. I see a handful of visitors, and there's a couple of people that I've never seen with us visiting before, and so let me explain what this is. On the first Sunday morning of every month, so this is the first Sunday morning of November, I have been doing a lesson that has something to do with marriage and family. And so this is my fourth one. This is my fourth lesson in this series of doing these. So the first one that we did 4 months ago was basically what is marriage? And we talked about the foundation of this is what God created marriage to be. He put the man in the garden to work it and to keep it, to do God's work and to take care of his stuff. And then he said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I'm going to make him a helper. And so there is the first marriage. And it's not only the first marriage, but it's the whole justification for what marriage is in the first place. A man and a woman are to help one another to do God's work and take care of his stuff. That's what marriage is. That's what marriage was created to be. And I understand that's not what a lot of people in our world think marriage is or how they treat marriage, but that's what God created marriage to be. The second lesson, the next month after that, was, and I said this at the very start, my thinking in all of this is I want to start at the bottom. I want to start at the foundation and just kind of build up from there. So that's the foundation. What is marriage in the first place? The next thing after that was that marriage is forever. It's something that was intended by God to be a permanent, lifelong arrangement, situation between a man and a woman. And again, this is not the way that the world looks at marriage or treats marriage. But we looked at several passages and different ideas throughout the scriptures that make this point. And so the idea is that marriage is not, well, I hope this works out, or I'll try at least to see if this works out. No. The idea of marriage is that marriage is forever. And there is a divine peace. There is a God peace involved in our marriage, in our relationships, that even if we think we want to try and break that marriage relationship, it cannot be broken. It's hard to appreciate that because you can't see it, but it's what the scripture says. And so there's some things that we need to think of with that. Marriage is forever. The third thing we talked about last month was the concept of faithfulness in marriage. And our faithfulness is our promise. That's what the marriage promise is. And so the example that I always give with this is whenever I stood at the front of the line in front of everybody else on my wedding day, and I made my promises to Becky. I did not promise that I will be perfect, or that I won't make mistakes, or, I'm sure that I said things that I was 20. Right? How much can a 20-year-old really know, I'm glad that I got married when I did, but looking back, it's like there's a lot in between then and now. But the promise that I made is not that I would be perfect or that I will never make any mistakes, but I promised that I would be faithful. I am yours wholly and entirely, and you are mine wholly and entirely. And that is a promise. That's a promise. When we make that promise, the promise to be faithful, that's a promise that we should speak confidently, without exception or room for error or mistake. I can do a lot of things in my marriage. I say nasty and hateful things. I'm negligent often in a lot of things that I do. There's zero room for unfaithfulness. She is my woman, and that's it. There are no others, period. And so faithfulness has got to be a part of this conversation. You can see the title that we're going to talk about. I'm going to refer a couple of times in this lesson to a book by Tim Keller called Sacred Marriage. No, that's not true. The Meaning of Marriage. Tim Keller, The Meaning of Marriage. Sacred Marriage, don't waste your time. It's okay. There's a few good ideas. Don't buy that book. You can buy it if you want. I just don't recommend it. It's silly. The Meaning of Marriage, I think you can get it for less than $20. It would be $18 well spent for anybody, no matter how long you've been married. It's a great book, and I recommend it. I yoinked that title for this lesson just straight out of this book. I didn't make it up. And there's a couple things in this lesson that I'll refer to with that book, and so that's kind of primary on my thoughts as I move through this. Just to give credit where credit is due. I don't want to be the guy who stands up here and pretends like I made a lot of stuff up when I didn't. So I want to start somewhere. I want to start somewhere that is going to seem probably, when we talk about this first point, there are four things. There's going to be four main points on the lesson for this morning. And I'm guessing that probably 2, 3, and 4 is what you're going to think this lesson is about. Number 1 is what this lesson is about. And so I just want to say it. You'll probably forget it. It's probably not the thing that you're going to remember, but at least I want to do my job to say my intent in this lesson is this is probably the most important slide. This is the most important thing that we're going to talk about today in this lesson as we talk about marriage. And if you want to give it a title that's not something just yanked straight out of a book, you could call it servant marriage. This is a lesson about how in marriage, if we want to have fulfillment and happiness and be the kind of marriage and home that God intended for us to be, we're going to have to serve one another. That's the point of this lesson. And this slide starts us off by saying, this isn't just a marriage thing. We're going to read in a couple minutes. We're going to read in Ephesians 5, the scripture reading that Clay did for us just a minute ago. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. And all of a sudden, everybody starts losing their minds. We live in 2024. Submit to your husband. What do you think this is, Medieval times. And people, I'm not kidding you. Sometimes when we've talked about this stuff in the past, I don't know it's because if you have to go to the bathroom or what, but people have gotten up and walked out the back, and I assume that it's because you don't want to talk about wives submit to your husbands as to the Lord. And we'll talk about the husband end of that in just a second. But here's the thing that I want you to think about. It should not, that sentence, wives submit to your husbands as to the Lord, it shouldn't sound like some kind of earth-shattering thing that you've never heard or done before, because as Christians, our entire existence is about submitting to someone else. And in fact, our entire existence is about submitting to a lot of different somebody else's. The title on this thing that I want you to understand on this point is every single thing about the Christian life is intended to be outward focused. And so here's a couple things to consider. In Genesis 1:26, God made man in his image and said, have dominion over all the stuff. And so the idea of that is Genesis chapter 2 and verse 15, where he says, he took the man, he put him in the garden to work it and to keep it. We were created. It's inside of us. It's what our DNA is programmed to be and do. We were created, designed by God to serve him, to do his work and to take care of his stuff. That's why God made us in the first place. There's a quote by Victor Hamilton that is one of the most powerful on this subject that I love, talking about God making Adam in the garden after man's image, according to his likeness, for the purpose of working and keeping the garden and all of this. Victor Hamilton says, even in the garden, the Lord of all is servant of all. It's what it means to be made in the image of God and what it means to be human, that my focus in life is to serve him, to submit my life to him, and to revolve every single thing about who I am and what I do according to his purposes. It's fundamental. This is the thing that you have to understand about this lesson before we can make any headway. This is the fundamental point. We were created for this. And then, number two, in Matthew chapter 22, a lawyer came up to Jesus and said, what's the most important thing that I need to know? What's the greatest commandment? What's at the very top of the list? The most important thing that you would say to me. And Jesus quoted to him Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5, and he said, this is the greatest command, that you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength. So listen, please, how can I say, listen to this, please, listen to this. Jesus said the words, the most important thing for you to know is to love and to live for God. Jesus said those words. This is the most important thing. And then he said, and the second most important thing is like it. And he quoted from Leviticus 19. And he said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Which in that context, the idea is, Jesus tells me, most important thing in my life, to love and to live for God. Second most important thing in my life, to love and to live for other people. It's everything. This is everything about who we are. The idea of serving should be something, I apologize for this because sometimes I'm like, we should talk about this more. I'm the guy who stands up here and talks about it all the time, right? So I'm criticizing me. This should be a major part of our conversation, serving, and what serving looks like. Okay, let's actually read this passage, Philippians chapter 2 and verses 3 through 8. Philippians chapter 2 and verses 3 through 8. Do nothing. Oh, hey, sorry, I forgot to say this part first. This isn't talking about marriage. This is just talking about what it means to be a Christian. Do nothing. If you are inclined to do this, you might even highlight the word nothing. Not some things, not only little things. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. One of the things that you've heard me talk about with this passage, if you are reading from a New American Standard Version in that passage, you'll notice that the word merely is italicized in that verse. In your New American Standard Version, what italics means is that the word was added for flow, right? To help you to try and read it. But the word was added. And so what happens if you read that passage without the added word? Let each of you look not to his own interest. Not merely to his own interest. In the English Standard Version, it's not only to his own interest. It's let each of you look not to his own interest, but also to the interests of others. This is the important part of this, I think. In verse 5, he says, this is what I want you to do and what I want you to understand. I want you to understand, Christians, that Christianity is to be modeled after Christ. So this stuff that we just talked about, put others before yourself, do nothing from selfish ambition, don't look to your own interests, but to the interests of others. For example, this is what it looks like in verse 5. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. That's how much, the example is how much are we supposed to put others before ourselves? Let's follow Christ's example. He even went to a cross and gave up his life for others. And that's our pattern. You see what I'm talking about here? This lesson about serving others and putting others ahead of yourself, this is a lesson about Christianity. We're going to put it under the umbrella today of marriage. And we are talking about marriage. But what we're talking about today is Christianity. And what it means to be a follower of Christ. And I've even hesitated, like, maybe I shouldn't even say follower of Christ, because this concept was true even before Christ. This is what it means to be a servant of the Lord, even before Jesus, to put others before yourself and to serve others. And then one last thing on this slide that I'd ask for you to think about. It was self-centeredness and selfish desire that ultimately led to the fall of all of God's perfect creation. The woman saw the food, that it was good for food. It looked pleasant to the eyes. And also look at what it can do for me. The lust of the flesh. I feel like I want it. The lust of the eyes. It looks good. I think I'd like to have that. The pride of life. I don't care what anybody says. I'm going to do this thing. Self-centeredness and selfish desire is literally the cause for every bad thing in this world. It's the thing that broke God's world. And so here's our transition to the next point. If self-centeredness and selfish desire are ultimately the things that ruin God's creation, what do you think is going to happen to your marriage when self-centeredness and selfish desire enter the picture? So with that, let's move on to point number 2. Point number 2 is that self-centeredness and selfish desire are the number one enemies of marriage. Or maybe I should define this a little more carefully and say at least a happy marriage or a fulfilling marriage. A marriage full of God's blessings that he intended for you to have. Self-centeredness and selfish desire are the enemies, the number one enemies of that. This is a quote from Tim Keller's book that I talked about earlier. The reason that marriage is so painful yet wonderful is because it is a reflection of the gospel, which is what we've been talking about. The gospel and Christianity really is just, marriage is a microcosm of that, a picture of that. But he says it's painful and wonderful. It's painful because who wants to die on the cross for somebody else? Who wants to put somebody else's interest or needs ahead of your own? Who wants to do that? Nobody wants to do that. That's why it's called the flesh. My flesh says, this is what I would really like to have right now. But Christianity says, no, I put others before me. That's painful. That's what he's talking about. In both the gospel and marriage, it is a painful way to live, but also wonderful. And the wonderful part is something that maybe I don't have words to explain that part. Maybe it's something that you just have to live. But it's kind of like camp. When people ask about camp and I try and explain camp to them, and I'm like, come, and we're going to all be outside in 110 degrees, and we're going to be filthy and stinky, and I'm explaining camp to them, and their faces going like, I'm like, you just have to, like, I can't say this to you with words. You just have to come and do it. I think that's the wonderful part of this. Putting another before yourself ultimately leads to wonderful things. But maybe you have to live it first. So let's do this. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 4. I'm not sure that I'm going to say that this lesson has a main text, but if there is a main text for this lesson, then it's going to be Ephesians 4 and 5. We're going to spend a little bit of time here. Andy and Brent talked a lot. I guess Andy talked a lot about Ephesians while he was here, and this is one of the things that he says. We've done, on me preaching through Ephesians, we've done 1 and 2. Tonight we're going to do chapter 3. And I'm going to jump ahead real quick because 1, 2, and 3 is look at what we have in the gospel. 4, 5, and 6 is this is how you're supposed to live because of that. And so chapter 4 and verse 1 is what starts this. I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Walk. Live your life in a manner that is worthy of the gospel that we talked about in chapters 1, 2, and 3. Look at chapter 5 and verse 2. I'm looking at the word walk and live your life. Chapter 5 and verse 2. Walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. That should sound familiar. Chapter 5 and verse 15. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise. And then in chapter 5 and verse 18, this is one of the ways that he says we're supposed to walk. I guess let's start, verse 18. He says, do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit. And so this is how you're supposed to walk as a child of God. Walk as if you are filled with the Spirit. And now he's going to give some examples of what that looks like. What does it mean? So verse 21, he says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And this is the point. I think I maybe should have done this. This maybe should have been on the first slide. We're not even talking about marriage yet. This is Christianity. To walk in a manner worthy of the gospel. To walk as if filled with the Spirit of God. Number 1 on that list is submitting to one another. Number 2 on that list is verse 22. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. And can you see now? Please, even if you have to go to the bathroom, don't get up right now. It's really important. Now's not the time. You can do it in the next point, but don't do it right now. This is why it's so crazy to me. Whenever we talk about wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, and people just lose their minds all of a sudden. Even Christians. This is even something that happens among our brothers and sisters. Even Christians. How dare you? What do you think this is? It's 2024. And the thing is, hey, this is just one example of a bunch of examples up to this point of how we're supposed to submit and serve everybody. Serve the Lord. Love your neighbor. Love and live for others before yourself. Submit to one another like you would to Jesus. Wives, this is an example. Submit to your husbands. We'll talk about some examples of what this might look like in just a second. But husbands, you don't get off the hook with this one in verse 28. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. For he who loves his wife loves himself. I think I should have started in verse 25. 25 is the passage that I really wanted. Husbands, love your wives. And then listen, here's the qualifier. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. You see that? The submit, servant marriage that we're talking about today. Husbands, in the same way that Christ entirely gave himself up, that's how you live for your wife. And this is always the conversation, always. Always the conversation when you talk about this, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, is that a husband will say something like, of course I would take a bullet for my wife or for my kids. I would give my life for my family. And I'm not minimizing. I think it's true. But us giving ourselves up for our wives as Christ did for his church is a life program, not a if I need to die for my family, I will. No, it is you put them entirely before yourselves in all things. That's what it means to love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So, number two is going to be two different points. Here's two things that I want you to take from this slide and that I want to think of. First of all, if you've got a problem in your marriage with serving the other, that my life is to be wholly for another, or the other way around, if my wife has a problem in marriage, she's not willing to submit and make her life wholly and entirely for others. If that's true in your marriage, you don't have a marriage problem, you have a Christianity problem. You have a faithfulness to the Lord and what God said problem, which also contributes to marriage problems, and who wants that? But I want you to see that this is a bigger thing. This is a part of who we are and what we were created to be. But the second thing is that in this text and in this conversation, we have a model for how our homes and our marriages are supposed to be and what they're supposed to look like, that my entire life is supposed to live, to love, and to live for another. You got that part? My entire life. Every aspect of my life. Well, what about? No. My entire life is to love and to live for another. And that's the way that it's supposed to go in the opposite direction, too. So, here is the affirmative picture. Before we get into some examples, maybe some things to think about with all of this. Imagine this phrase at the top, mutual fulfillment through mutual sacrifice. Imagine a home where both the husband lives for and sacrifices himself for his wife, and the wife does the same, lives for and sacrifices herself for her husband. Imagine a home where wives submit not only to the Lord and not only to other people in the church and not only to their bosses and not only to their kids' school schedules and the calendar, but also to their husbands. Imagine a home where wives submit themselves to their husbands and where husbands give themselves up entirely for their wives. Before I go to the last slide where I start thinking about some examples to do this, this is one of the things that I'll say. If we're imagining a home where both husband and wife live this way and do these things, I tried this week when I was walking my dog to think of some examples of trouble in marriage that are not rooted in this. I couldn't think of any. If you can put this kind of Christianity, to love and to live for others, your spouse, to live to serve another, if you can put that into your heart and live it, I can almost promise you, I don't feel ready to jump off this bridge and just full out say, I promise you, if you do this though, I can almost promise you that all of your marriage problems will go away with this in the foundation. So let's talk about a couple of different examples. What are we going to do with prime time? This is going to look different for different people in different stages of life. But I think this one might be an example that probably most of us can relate to. I get up early in the morning and go to work. And I worked all day, and it was a hard day. And this day that I'm talking about right now was not a good day. So I'm grouchy. And I come home, and I'm tired at the end of this day, and frustrated at the same time. And I walk into my house, and there are some things that I would really like right now. Maybe I would like to change into some other clothes and go for a jog. Like I just want to get out, and I want to be by myself, and I want to have a second. Just give me a second. I want to go outside, right? Maybe it's not a jog. Some of you are sitting there and you're like, I totally don't relate with that at all. Maybe it's video games. I don't care. Fill in the blank, right? I've been at work all day. I want to come home. I want to unwind. I want to, talk with my friends on the internet, whatever it is. Okay, part one. Here is my situation. I come home. There's my prime time. It's the one spot in the day that I have. Becky has also been up, not just all day, she was up all night dealing with the sick kids. And because they're sick, they didn't sleep very good. They got up early. She's been having a rough time. They were doing this all day long. I've got this list of stuff that I wanted to accomplish today, and I didn't get a single thing done, and now there's more on the list than was there. Haven't had a shower, haven't had any food. This is real life stuff, right? Most of us can probably remember a day like this. And so I come home after my day, and I walk in the house, and she says, good, I'm getting out of here. I want to go outside for a jog and have some time for me for just 30 minutes. Like, I would kill somebody for those 30 minutes. I just want those 30 minutes. And so, maybe it's not going out for a walk or a jog. Maybe it's something else. I got to run errands. I just got to get out of the house. And I don't want to take the kids with me. So I will come home after my day. She's had her day. And this is our situation. Or you could do this 1,000 different ways, right? Maybe prime time for you is in the morning. For me, if I don't exercise in the morning, I don't exercise. That's just the end of the sentence. I say to myself sometimes, I'll do it after work. The devil is the father of lies, and that is the best one that he tells. And so who's going to get the morning? Like, who's going to have to take care of the kids so that the other person can have the morning? Primetime stuff. This is a real Ellisville scenario. I bet this is real for some of you. Sunday, we go to worship 3 times. Bible class, morning worship, evening worship. On Monday night, we have a marriage study. On Tuesday night, Becky goes out to dinner with some ladies from church. On Wednesday night, we come back for Bible study. On Thursday night, I have another Bible study with somebody. On Friday, there is another baby shower. On Saturday, or wedding shower, it doesn't have to be that or something. Some get-together, potluck, it could be anything. Saturday, the toilets are nasty and the laundry's dirty, but we have to do it because there's people coming through town next week and they're going to stay with us and the house has got to be clean. We've done this, right? We've all done this over and over again. And so the question is, what's this going to look like in your home? If you are a self-centered person and your own selfish desires are the only thing that matter for you and your world, I'm tempted to say that your marriage won't survive this. And that's probably an exaggeration. Maybe your marriage will survive it. You're not going to be happy, though. There's not going to be any fulfillment. If every aspect of these scenarios that we just talked about, your approach is, but I'm tired, and I had a long day, and I want to go outside. I want to play video games, but I want to go out and do this. Self-centeredness and selfishness are the enemies of marriage in this situation, and also the opposite of all Christianity. But what would it look like in each of these scenarios if both the husband and wife sacrificed themselves as Christ sacrificed himself for the church and said, you know what? You, not I. That's our invitation song today. Not I, but Christ. What would a home look like if wives submitted to their husbands as to the Lord, and husbands loved their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her? How about example number 2? Actively meeting your spouse's needs. I'm curious if anybody has ever heard any of these sentences before. A wife won't be affectionate with her husband because she doesn't feel like it, and the husband is getting frustrated. Other side. The husband isn't interested in helping his wife feel like it because he's tired and had a long day. Both of these situations, the inward focus is the problem. A wife has poured all of her affection and all of her attention and all of her time into her kids. And by the way, this has been going on for 8 years now. There's nothing left in the tank for the husband. My husband won't spend time with me. He won't even talk to me. We don't talk anymore. We used to talk all the time, but we don't talk anymore. My wife doesn't appreciate me. Nothing I do is ever enough. It's always more, more, more. And she sure doesn't respect me. What would every single one of these situations look like if self-centeredness and selfish desire was not the driving force in that person, but rather me giving myself up entirely for another? What would these marriages look like if we lived like Christians in this way? Last thing. I got one more thing for you. I am really tempted to just skip this last slide. I don't want to ruin it. I think we got a good point out there. This is what Christianity is. I think this is going to be the key to your happy marriage in your home. And I'm about to ruin it by saying something bad, like this last thing is going to be really bad, but I think it needs to be said. And so, sorry about that from the very start. Number 4 on this list, my outward-focused, not self-centered Christian life is not conditional upon my wife's self-centeredness or sacrificial life. What I mean by that is a scenario. Let's do a scenario so I can illustrate it rather than with words. My husband never puts me first, ever, in anything. So guess what? I'm not going to sacrifice and put him first either. Until he learns to figure it out, sorry, you're on your own. You didn't sacrifice for me. You won't give yourself up for me. So I'm not going to sacrifice and give myself up for you. And point number 4 is no. My Christian life that is outwardly focused on other people and my sacrifice is not conditional upon another person's behavior or lack of behavior. I get up and go to work every day to provide for my family, and my family depends upon my paycheck and my ability to work, and we just had a baby, and my wife is staying at home to raise that baby, and she wants me to get up in the night to help take care of the crying baby. And my response to something like that would be, hey man, you're not going to sacrifice for me. I'm not sacrificing for you. Like, we got a problem here. In both of those situations and 1,000 others like them, we've got a big problem. And so maybe we try and communicate through it. That's the first step. Let's try and communicate through this. I want to explain to you, no, I'm not going to get up in the night with the crying baby because I work all day and my work depends upon this, and you stay at home and this is what you do. Take a nap when the baby takes a nap. Who cares if the laundry gets done? It's fine. We'll try and communicate through some of these things, and sometimes either communication doesn't work or the other person doesn't care. Now we have a problem. So here's the hard part of this lesson. If you want to turn over to 1 Peter 3, that's where we're going to read next. The hard part about this lesson is that some of you either have or will in the future make bad choices and marry somebody who doesn't care anything about what we're talking about right now, and you're stuck. That's the end of the sentence. You're just stuck. I'm sorry to say it. I'm not trying to be callous. I take no enjoyment. There's no pleasure in me describing it like this, but your spouse's refusal to live as a Christian and to do the stuff that we've been talking about today does not negate your responsibility to live like a Christian and keep doing your part. That's what 1 Peter is talking about. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 1 says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word," you know what that's describing? Wives, even if your husband is not what he's supposed to be, you be subject to your own husbands, that they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. And I know that there's 100 different directions that we could go with those couple of verses, but the thing that I want you to think about in what we're talking about right now is, wives, just because your husband doesn't act like he's supposed to act, Peter said you still have to act like you're supposed to act. And the thing about that is true for every part of life. I can only control myself. I can't control my spouse. Look over at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. There's another one. I'm going to give you two passages on this one because it's a hard pill to swallow. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verses 11 and 12. No, verses 12 and 13. "To the rest I say, I not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him." And the idea is me living like a Christian and sacrificing myself and giving myself up for my wife as Christ did for the church is not conditional upon whether she does what she's supposed to do. I do what I'm supposed to do no matter what she does. And this is the last thing that I'll say about this, and then I'll wrap this up. Some of you have, some of you will come at some point. I hope you do. I hope I've got things to say. There are some things that I would like to say about this. If you've got trouble in your marriage and you need help, I would like to walk with you down that road. Like this is what we do. I'm happy to do that. And I know that our elders feel the same. If you need to talk to somebody about this, talk with one of our elders about it. They're ready to talk with you and help you about this stuff. But here's the thing. I can only speak for myself, but I will almost promise you that the same is going to come from the mouths of our elders. If you come to us and you say, "Hey, I've got this problem in my home, in my marriage, and I need some help. How am I going to get over this hump? What's the next step?" I can almost promise you that every single one of us is going to say the same thing. You can only control you. There's nothing you can do to make the other person do. You live like a Christian and sacrifice yourself. Submit to your husband. Give yourself up as Christ did for the church. Whatever you need to do. Oh man, Ryan, that's really hard. Yeah. Let's talk to Jesus about dying on the cross for a world that hated him before we start talking about how hard it is. Yeah, it is hard. There's another part of this. Some of you have made mistakes or will make mistakes and married somebody who doesn't care. Even after communication, they don't care and they won't change. There's another part of this that I'll say. This will be the last thing and then I'll be done. The last thing is some of us take longer to figure it out than others. And so maybe it's not a hopeless situation where you look at somebody and say, oh man, you're stuck. But maybe this is a years-long process for one of the two to learn how to live like a Christian and what that means. And that means that you've got years of living like a Christian unconditionally. Years is a long time. So I don't want to finish on that, but I think that part needs to be said in this. All of this ultimately is about Christianity. And Christianity is to die to myself and live, number one, for the Lord, number two, for others in whatever situation we might find those circumstances. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, this is what the invitation is. If you know that Jesus is Lord and you're ready to hand your life over to him, when you come forward and say, I want to be a Christian, what you're doing is saying, no more me. My life is now outward focused. No more self-centeredness, no more selfish desire, no more me. I'm dying to myself. Not I, but Christ. If we can help you with that today, come forward as we stand and sing the invitation song.